This is Matthew Cratter from Trader University, and today I want to talk about Afghanistan and the decline of America. There have been a lot of news stories about this, but I think it's important to view it in the context of a couple of things. In the context of late empire decadence and bureaucracy, which often leads to the fall of one superpower and the rise of a new superpower, which itself is always accompanied by the end of one currency regime and the start of a new currency regime. So in order to talk about this, we obviously have to rewind back to 9/11, back to September 11th. And looking back on it, I have to say that this was really a turning point. Pre-9/11, it was much easier. I would say the country was much more innocent. It was much easier, though not always possible, but much easier to trust politicians, to trust experts, to trust military experts, to trust the news programs on TV. Post 9/11, things began to get really weird, and we began to have a lot more political polarization and a lot of events happening that were very difficult to understand and that are still very difficult to understand. Obviously, 9/11 was a huge human tragedy. Almost 3,000 people died, the vast majority of them completely innocent people going to the office or riding on an airplane. In terms of the insurance losses, the monetary cost, approximately $40 billion. I believe this includes both the skyscrapers and the airplane. So there was a loss of human life. There was a monetary loss. But the response was very strange, and the response was actually ended up being much more expensive than the original attacks. So of the 19 men who participated in the 9/11 attacks, all of them affiliated with Al-Qaeda, they came from just 4 countries, 15 of them from Saudi Arabia, 2 from UAE, 1 from Lebanon, and 1 from Egypt. So the really bizarre thing that happened then is we turned around and invaded Afghanistan and invaded Iraq. This was one of the really strange things. Iraq makes a little bit of sense because Saddam had recently started selling his oil for euros, the recently created euro, and this threatened the whole petrodollar system. So in one sense, I think 9/11 was used as a shield or an excuse to attack Saddam, whom the U.S. had supported for many years, and then obviously fought the first Gulf War against him under George W.'s father, the senior George Bush. But the really strange thing was invading Afghanistan. We have this famous quote from Alexander the Great: "May God keep you away from the venom of the cobra, the teeth of the tiger, and the revenge of the Afghans." The people, especially the neocons surrounding George W. Bush, really did not understand history. They did not understand how Britain was humiliated just a century, or call it a century and a half earlier, trying to invade Afghanistan, being repulsed. The same thing happened with the Soviets. Ironically, during this war, the U.S. was actually funding Osama bin Laden to fight against the Soviets, and many believe that Osama bin Laden was actually directly trained by the CIA. So we have this strange thing where the U.S. supports Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, then turns against them. Very strange stuff like this. But when we look at the context of 3,000 people dying and 40 billion in losses, the wars that resulted from 9/11 as a result of human choice, they were not inevitable. These cost approximately $6.5 trillion. And the human cost, the number of U.S. soldiers and allied lives, civilians on the ground in all these countries, innocent women and children, quote unquote, collateral damage. This cost was huge. And if we want to look at the context for it, 6.4 trillion is approximately 21% of the current U.S. debt outstanding, the public debt in terms of treasuries, not off-balance sheet debt, but on-balance sheet debt. So this is a huge amount of money that was financed using debt for a series of senseless wars. We did end up eventually getting Saddam Hussein, and we did end up getting Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was captured more using Palantir software than any sort of military force. What makes this kind of spending possible, this sort of superpower spending possible? Well, it's the exorbitant privilege of being able to print US dollars. And one of the great historical ironies is that this retreat from Afghanistan happened 50 years, I believe to the day, to the Nixon Shock, when Nixon suspended the convertibility of the U.S. dollar into gold. When you're no longer anchored or bound to hard assets, it's very easy to print up a lot of money and go fight wars. If you're finding this video helpful so far, I'd encourage you to hit that subscribe and like button and maybe share the video with a few of your friends as well. So we had some very poor choices made by George W. Bush and his colleagues who gave him very bad advice. This was continued under Obama. A lot of people don't remember this, and I don't want, this is not meant to be a partisan rant in any way, so I want to show really how both sides contributed to it. Obama dramatically ramped up the number of troops from 30,000 troops in Afghanistan to 100,000 troops in 2011. So he sort of doubled down on Bush policy. As we continued to lose the war, there became big political pressure, Trump calling as well, to pull everyone out of Afghanistan, and then Biden finally doing it a couple days ago. And this is another example of just incredible bizarreness where just a few days ago he says there's going to be no one lifted off the roof. It's not going to look like a Vietnam sort of retreat. The likelihood that there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. And so this really contributes more to the distrust of our political leaders and our experts. And it's really beyond me how we could leave so many innocent people behind, leave so many Americans behind, leave so much military equipment as well. This is really incompetence at the highest level, and it really spans both sides of the political spectrum. Complete breakdown in the trust of government officials, experts. This is really a continuation of what's happened since the start of the war on terror. That being said, there has been a cynical agenda, as government officials like to say. I think it was Rahm Emanuel who said this first: never let a crisis go to waste. One of the results of the 9/11 attacks and the U.S. response to it was the setting up of huge amounts of bureaucracy. TSA, for example, came out of this. Things like the Department of Homeland Security. These organizations, these bureaucracies do a little bit of good. They're mostly giant wastes of money, and they're mostly security theater. I can't tell you how many times I've been patted down and taken to the side, even when I have like a baby stroller with me a few years back. And so one way of never letting a crisis going to waste is just ramping up the government's control and bureaucracy in response. One of the other aspects, one of the banking aspects of 9/11 was the USA Patriot Act, which made it illegal to conceal moving $10,000 in or out of the country. This is ridiculous. This is just a clamping down on a basic human right to move your wealth wherever you want to. And so the things that came out of 9/11 were in many ways much more toxic and a waste of money and a waste of human lives than the actual attacks themselves. So we have the situation where trillions of dollars were wasted, untold human cost in terms of life, limb, suffering. We betrayed the people on the ground who worked for the U.S., and we pull out in such a disorganized and embarrassing manner. But what's going to happen? Who will be held responsible for this? Where are there going to be the firings? If this were Rome or Persia in the old days, I should say maybe in the ancient days, there'd be mass executions of generals and other military planners. But there doesn't seem to be any taking of responsibility by anyone. And this has been going on for a while. This has been going on really since the great financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. 47 bankers went to jail. Most of them were from Iceland. There was only one person put in jail in the U.S., which is a guy named Kareem Sarah-Gilden, who I guess was a banker. But all the heads of the big banks never served any jail time. They paid some small fines, which were just sort of the cost of doing business for the billions that were made. So this is what late empire looks like. It's bureaucratic. No one takes responsibility. It's completely incompetent as well. Meanwhile, the U.S. military, instead of actually focusing on doing things like winning wars. We have a top U.S. general talking about how he's been reading Mao and Lenin and studying white rage and critical race theory. That's fine. Maybe these are issues that need to be studied, but it'd be really nice if we could also win wars in the meantime. People like General Mark Milley should obviously be fired in the wake of what's happened in Afghanistan. But of course, nothing will happen. Nothing would have happened under Trump, and nothing will happen under Biden because no one takes responsibility anymore in the U.S. We have this history of having the war on drugs, the war on terror. As I said, never let a crisis go to waste. What usually happens is these are just excuses for growing their bureaucracy, setting up completely new departments, new czars like the drug czar, for example, and spending a lot of taxpayer money. But it's much worse than that because it's not just taxpayer revenues that get spent, but actually the U.S. debt gets massively increased, as we've seen. And this contributes to the ultimate decline of the U.S. dollar fiat financial system. This is why we're at the end. We're at the fourth turning, which is the 20 years at the end of the 80-year cycle. We're at the end of the long-term debt cycle where all the debt can never be paid back and needs to be monetized instead. And so war, and especially the war on terror and all the political and military incompetence that surrounded it, really are contributing to the end of the current financial system, which we see unraveling. As I said, we need to view this in the context of the fourth turning, the long-term debt cycle, and the transition between superpowers and a new currency system. What I have my eye on is the 2022 Winter Olympics, which are scheduled to take place in February of 2022. And I think there's a reasonable chance, these are obviously being held in Beijing, they're the Winter Games. I think there's a reasonable chance that after this happens, we see China make a move on Taiwan. It wouldn't make any sense to do it before that, but I think we could see something much worse than we've even seen in Hong Kong. And now that we are globally broadcasting our incompetence in matters of war and fighting, this only encourages the Chinese Communist Party. And we're not just talking about Taiwan. A lot of people don't realize that this is the real map of Taiwan. We have a cold Taiwan up here. I guess there's a lot of snow up there. We have gun Taiwan. We have really East Taiwan. And my favorite, we have pizza Taiwan, which must include all of Europe. So when we're talking about China invading Taiwan, we're really talking about a much larger problem than just Taiwan itself. This is one reason I think it's very important as we enter this final stage of the fourth turning, as we watch the long-term debt cycle come to a close, as we watch the decline of the U.S. as a superpower and the rise of China. It's very, very important to have an asset that cannot be confiscated, that can be moved anywhere, that can be moved across borders, that cannot be censored, and that can be used in a permissionless fashion. And there's really only one cryptocurrency that qualifies for this. Ethereum, you can shut down with a couple phone calls. All the other cryptos have headquarters, they have CEOs, they have legal counsels. They can be co-opted by governments. Only Bitcoin is decentralized, and Bitcoin does not tell you what you can do. Bitcoin gives you freedom, and I think it's a very important place to hide in the coming years, given this context we've seen, and as we see the continued unraveling of the U.S. as a late empire. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video, and let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.